First up, we have Elle, the lovely Elle. Elle is a content strategist consultant, has been for 15 years, so she must have started when she was, what, 8? Yeah, she paid me for that one. So today your talk is about wayfinding and IAs, which if you write documentation, the worst thing that can happen is no one finds it and no one reads it. So put your hands together for Elle.
Good.
You're good.
I'm sure that bit wasn't recorded. It's so nice to see you guys, and I love when we have this opportunity to get together and talk about content, and one of my favourite absolute things, which is information architecture. So what I wanted to do, first of all, is add to that delightful introduction that Warren gave. I started my life as a radio journalist. I really enjoyed it. You really couldn't call it work. It was one of the funnest things I've ever done. I love bossing people around, and basically I boss people around in a radio studio every day, Monday to Friday. It was really fabulous. I learned so much about the world through the stories that I covered. Then I decided I wanted to earn a bit of money, so I became a project manager, in which I learned many important skills, but I really felt the call of that content and communication, and I wanted to get back to finding a way to talk to people, a way to build narrative. And so I became a content strategist, and I wanted to share with you my flavour of content strategy. Generally, when I do chat with people, I like to do this because I think you and I know that so many of the roles that we have can be interpreted in different ways by different people. So my flavour of content strategy is one where I'm very much focusing on digital strategy, information architecture, which we'll be talking about today, content modelling, content auditing. I love workshop facilitation. I really love coaching. I love working with teams and drawing out this fabulous expertise that they sometimes don't even know that they have. So what we're going to talk about today is information architecture. So let me step it through. I want to talk about an intro, the inputs to IA, some tools that you're going to find super valuable, activities, how you can sell IA, it's really important, the outputs that you should be creating, and I'll give you some additional resources to learn a bit more. We've got about 25 minutes together today, so it's going to be really high level. Please forgive me, but I'll show you some opportunities and places that you can learn more if you find your appetite has been whetted. So let's kick it off. Starting with an introduction to information architecture. I think it's a really good place to start is thinking about the difference between IA and navigation. It's sometimes easy to get it mixed up. So when we're talking about IA, you might see that expressed as a sitemap, and it could be in a spreadsheet, could even be in a mind map. And navigation is really distinct from that. Our very close colleagues in design will be looking at navigation and looking at the visual expression of that information architecture and the sitemap, be it. And I always like to think about a mobile first navigation because it really does affect the way that you craft your information architecture. So the other elements, I guess, is, and these are things that you're probably going to be familiar with, so I'm going to work over these quite quickly. Mental models. Who here hasn't heard the concept of mental models before? Okay, so most of you have, that's great. But basically what mental models are is a fancy way of talking about how it is that people think about things and potentially how they think about systems. So a lovely example is your mental model of a bird, for example. So if you think about birds, there's penguins and there's flamingos, and they're really quite drastically different in the way they manifest themselves. And a classic prototypical mental model of a bird might be something closer to a sparrow. You know, that's like a really typical bird space. But it's kind of like, you think, why are we talking about animals? Well, I think the core thing about mental model is about empathy and understanding how a potential audience thinks about systems and potentially thinks a bit about taxonomy. Oh, whoops, I was behind myself. Apologies. I don't know how you could have followed without that red dot there. The next thing that I think is really important and you need to have a really good grounding in when you're thinking about information architecture is taxonomy. And a really easy way to think about this is if it isn't something that, like me, is at the top of your mind most days, is to think about something as simple as the Dewey System. It's something you would have encountered when you're a kid or a student at uni and you're thinking about how information is categorized in a library. It's a really nice way to think about what a taxonomy is. And of course, I guess categorization is a little bit different. So if we think about a digital space, think about how your favorite clothes shop might organize their clothes on their website. So it might be by gender, it might be by color, might be by the type of clothing, so top or bottom, might be by the fabric. It might even be the activity that you're doing when you're wearing those clothes. So these are all ideas of categorization and taxonomy. This is a very deep and complicated kind of subject matter of which I'm spending 20 seconds with you. So if you're interested in more, please do let me know and I can show you places to learn more. Now, when we're talking about information architecture, we're not just thinking about categorizing content, and it can be kind of an easy trap to fall into. But there's a bit of a paradox in that trap because instinctually you know that information architecture is about getting you from one place to the next. But it can be really easy when you're working with spreadsheets and with pools of content in a mind map, for example, to forget that you're actually facilitating pathways through the content. So it's just really important to draw your attention to that. I guess the last piece that's really important as well that a lot of people forget about is branding. And you think, oh, hang on a tick, how does information architecture relate to branding? I think a really lovely example or a lovely way to think about that is not now, but think maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. Think about a box that you would have bought a product from Apple in. So it's like, okay, we all know about the Apple example there. It's white, it's clean. There's maybe a photo of the product and maybe one word, very, very little copy in addition to that. And then think about the classic Microsoft box, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Today, they're quite similar, but 4 or 5 years ago, you would have seen a lot of difference. You would have seen like some dramatic color by now, and you would have seen a lot of feature copy. So your information architecture is also a really important expression of branding. So, and even another way to think about it is the difference between Google and Yahoo in the old days. So Yahoo, you would have thought potentially was a really excellent information architecture because you could see very easily, and a lot of librarians and information organizers loved Yahoo because they could really see those categorizations beautifully. But Google, on the other hand, really gives you this single porthole into a whole wealth of content. So it's another way just to think, can the organizational branding be manifest? Well, one way is through information architecture. So, a lot of talking. I want to hear from you guys. Tell me, I want to hear about your experience in crafting information architecture. So can someone yell out an experience they've had recently where they've been thinking about IA? Lovely, yes. So what you're coming to straight away, Rox, is you're thinking about your audience and you're thinking about what it is that they need to do. So when you think about information architecture, you're thinking about who you're trying to serve and what they're trying to do. Anyone else been working on an information architecture project recently and had any interesting insights out of it? And it's fine if you haven't. Yes, sir. Interesting. So an information overload problem, it's something that I will talk about in the rest of the session, but it feels like a very common need. Anyone else here feel like their audience, their customers, their users have a similar problem that you're trying to mitigate? A lot of information and you really want to assist and guide them to get to what they need straight away. Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm really talking about classic information architecture in this talk, but there are a whole bunch of peripheral and connecting disciplines and search engine optimization and a whole bunch of other techniques can really help when you're thinking about that challenge. You'll have to invite me back, Swapnil, so we can talk about that another time. All right, so let's talk about inputs to your IA. What do you actually need if you're going to sit down and you've got your challenge and you're thinking, I want to create a much more streamlined, a crisp experience for my audience? How do you go about doing that? Knowing, of course, that we have a very diverse content set, most of you will, and a very diverse audience set. So, classic. Who here hasn't done an audit? No one. I love that. We're in a room of experts. Okay, all right. So an audit is, and I'll talk to you about very, very quickly about some tools to create a really fabulous audit. It feels like it's a really dry and unsexy task, and it is in a lot of ways, but it's also a really fabulous foundational piece for creating an information architecture. You need to know what your current state is. And you might think, well, hang on a tick, I'm doing a greenfield project. I don't know what my current content is. No problem. There are some other things that you can do to establish what the drivers of that site should be. But as your very first step, you should be creating a content audit. You should be using you can use the content management system to rip out the details of your site. You can use a crawler to rip out the details of your site. You can even use Google Analytics to rip out, or Adobe Analytics, or whatever your analytics system is, to get you a sense of what you currently have. Then you need to analyze that audit. You need to look for patterns. You need to understand how people are consuming that content. You need to see how content's grouped together. You need to look for patterns around content types and templates. You need to understand are there any patterns around when that content was last published? You need to understand, are there any patterns around how that content was, or whom it was published by? And this is a really critical step in order to craft a fabulous IA. And of course, you want to mush that in with your Google Analytics. You want to understand, okay, I've identified these patterns of content. How are they being consumed? What areas of content are of interest to my users, to my customers, to the people, my audience, the people I'm trying to talk to? Now, this is really key. As many insights as you can possibly get about the people whom you're trying to serve. A lot of us will work in organizations where it's not really easy to get access to user research. There are a whole bunch of ways that you can do guerrilla user research yourself, but it's so important if you're creating an information architecture to understand who your audience is and what they're trying to do, and that comes best from user research. There are a whole bunch of other ways you can do it. For example, analyzing call center data, Google Analytics, surveys, but your user research is a really key input. Out of that, you should be building user tasks. And you may find that this is a really great opportunity to liaise with your design colleagues, your UX design colleagues. It's funny, I do a lot of this work. I've done user research and I do user task or user scenario building. But in some projects, I will be working with another team member who's actually doing that, and both of which are fantastic because you always learn from people and think, oh, that's a slightly interesting way of doing things, which is great. For some reason, I always come up with 16 user tasks. I don't know why. It might be some peculiar thing of my brain, but it just works. It works perfectly, and I can generally get a really lovely prioritized user task matrix with the number 16. I don't know why, but it works. And of course, last but definitely not least, what is it that you're trying to do with this information architecture? Again, thinking about the key messages, or if you want to go to the very bottom line, what are you trying to sell? It might be an idea, it might be a behavior change, it might be a product. What are you trying to sell? You must understand that very, very clearly. So, tools. These will be kind of cool. And I'd love to get a sense of who's been using what. Who's used TreeJack? Okay, mind blown, guys who haven't put your hand up. Seriously, you just get your phones out and just type down TreeJack right now. It is something that you need to know about. It is the most fabulous way to test and help you build an information architecture. You can probably tell by the similarity between the logos. TreeJack and Optimal Sort are made by the same folk. I think it's actually Optimal Sort who makes Optimal Sort, kind of confusingly. I might have that wrong. But basically, Optimal Sort is a card sorting tool. So you will need to be doing some sort of card sorting when you're building your IA. it's a really great way to help you start to build blocks of content and understand how those blocks of content fit together and understand how those blocks of content fit with the user journeys that you've identified in that last slide. Screaming Frog is a brilliant tool. It's free if you want a crawl of less than 500 pages. So if you've got a small site, it's brilliant. And what it does, you can just put any website into it. You download the application onto your computer, and it's actually an SEO tool. But what it does is it does a scrape. It's just like you had gone and clicked on every single website and recorded the URL, what the title is, what's the word count of copy on that page, is it 404ing, is it 200ing, is it 301ing, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And if you pay for it, you can actually connect it with Google Analytics, which gives you a really lovely comprehensive position to start a redesign project. I use Google a lot because I use the Google suite for all my work, and it really helps me when I'm collaborating with, I use my spreadsheet in Google Docs. The problem with Google Docs spreadsheet is that it is going to break down when you put too many rows in there. So if you've got over like 5,000, use Excel instead. But if you've got less than 5,000, use Google spreadsheet. They'll do pivoting just as beautifully as Excel will, and which is what you need to do. So, and again, if you're going to be an information architect, you need to know how to use spreadsheets, and at the very least, you need to know how to use a pivot table. And it is a bit weird at first, and then you will be surprised, and you won't understand how you ever lived without pivot tables, because they are the best thing ever. And the other thing that I do use quite a lot is MindMeister, because information architecture is, I really do believe it's 50% building and 50% selling. And MindMeister is a great mind mapping tool. You can use whatever your favorite mind mapping tool is. It doesn't matter what it is, but it allows you to show or express maybe 1, 2, 3 top levels of your information architecture really easily with your stakeholders. And you can. It gives you a hierarchy view. So normally you'd see like a radial view in a mind map, but it allows you to like shift them all into a hierarchy view. So it kind of almost looks like a sitemap instantly. So I'm constantly looking for tools that help me work quicker. And the beautiful thing about MindMeister is that you can rip out a version of your hierarchy, your sitemap, your proposed information architecture from that tool and dump it straight into TreeJack to test it. And again, looking for efficiency, that's a really lovely marriage between those two. Anyone used Screaming Frog before? No. All right. Yes. Wonder why. Okay, so let's talk about the activities. So we've talked about basically what IA is. I know you already knew that. Thank you for letting me have that conversation. We talked about some inputs that I think are really important for you to help you build your IA. We talked about some tools. Now, what are we actually going to do? So, well, I talked a little bit about those user tasks before. I mentioned that it's really good to be working with your design colleagues. Who's created user tasks before in a website context? Great. Can you tell me what the user task is that you created? No worries. Did you have your hand up? Yeah, well, that's a nice way of thinking about it. And that's almost like something that you might put in a Jira issue, right? When you're doing a build. But yeah, it's a similar kind of concept. So, for example, I've just been doing some work for the Australian Museum, and I might think a parent with 3 small children wants to be able to find out if there pram minding activities at the museum. That would not be included in my user scenarios, by the way. It's too niche. But I might think, so I'd be thinking, but I would put them all down. I'd have this massive list, and then along with the stakeholder, I would establish a very clear Magic 16, which covers most of the really business critical user tasks. Has anyone else had cause to, and you know what, you might not have done it formally, but you will have done it instinctually. You've been thinking, I have a particular audience group that I know is important, and I know that they're trying to do a particular thing. So for example, while I was working at Atlassian, we would look at the data that came from service desk or the people that were serving customers who were having difficulty. And one of the biggest pain points for customers of Atlassian was Jira, I've forgotten now, permissions. figuring out Jira permissions is really tricky. You need to really have your game face on if you want to do it right. And so they would be looking for lots of help and support on that. So then you'd go, okay, that is a critical task that I need to service, and I need to service very carefully and place emphasis on when it comes to my information architecture. So, of course, the audit, we've talked a bit about that, but I'd like to get into the card sort. Who's done a card sort before? Give me a raise of hands. Swapnil has. Couple? Okay, great. This is a really kind of fun thing that you can do with your colleagues tomorrow. Can I challenge you to do this? So this is your task for tomorrow. Grab Screaming Frog, get a crawler over the top 500 of the site that you're currently responsible for. Doesn't matter that it doesn't do the whole thing. Export it to Excel. Use a pivot. Figure it out. Google pivot. If you don't know how to do it, you'll thank me. And find big chunks of content from that crawler. And then get a bit of paper, A5, A4 bit of paper, chop it into 6 and write down some big blobs of content. And then you and a colleague get together and think about how you might arrange that content. And you're not doing it for any means except for the fact that you're now handling subject matter on cards, and you're now at the next meetup when someone says, have you done a card sort? You can say, yes, absolutely, I have. And I kind of get the concept. It's an integral skill for an information architect. I'm so sorry. There's so many complicated things that I am just rushing over with giving you 20 seconds when we could literally have a one-day workshop on card sorting because it's the best. So there are a whole bunch of ways that you can do things, right? So a useful way to start is to think about what kind of content do I have on this site? So you might think, so recently I did some work with Qantas. Well, think about that. So there's information for people who are flying. There's information for people who are wanting to book. There's information about destinations. And so you might start literally creating cards, destinations, making a booking, checking a booking, and you start just building this, I guess, ecosystem of potential content. And there's 2 types of card sorting that you can do. You can do closed card sorting or open card sorting. It sounds confusing. It's really not. Closed means you already have the labels that you want people to put stuff into predetermined. You know what they are, possibly because you've already done some other research and you think you've got a good handle on those labels. Open is open slather. That's a nice way to kind of remember it. You can invite your participants to not only arrange cards, but also to label those cards. So you might give them blank cards and say, you put a whole bunch of things together. Granny Smith. Oh, I can't think of any other apples. This is a terrible example. Pink ladies, thank you. Any other apples? Gala, thank you. So these, Granny Smith, Pink Lady, Gala, and then you give them blank cards and they think, I'm going to put an apple label on top of them. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. At the end, I'll show you some resources to learn more about card sorting. I remember when I was first learning about it years and years ago, it felt a little bit arcane. And by that, I mean kind of secret and a bit impenetrable. And then I did it and I was like, I wish I had done that earlier. So I definitely encourage you to have a play around with it. And again, when you're card sorting, you might think about the ways that you want to categorize in certain taxonomy. So you can organize information by subject, by time, by geography, by task, by the audience member or the audience group that's most interested in that content. And your card sorting will help you figure out the mental models that your audience think are most appropriate. So when you're creating an information architecture, you might like to build a prototype. You can do that in a whole bunch of different ways. The prototype I generally build is in TreeJack, which is one of the tools that I talked to you about, and I'll talk to you a bit more about. But you can do it in a whole bunch of ways. If you've got a really fantastic front-end dev with you or just someone who's clever, you can create kind of prototypes of how the information architecture might look expressed in the navigation, which is a trick for new players because there can be a whole bunch of ways your information architecture is stressed by a particular level of navigation. For example, this is a bit of a tricky thing to explain if you haven't seen it before, probably because I'm not very good at explaining it, so please forgive me. But when you're crafting a navigation for mobile, think about Windows Explorer or Mac Explorer, right? So you have a folder, and in that folder, you have a whole bunch of objects, PDFs, Word documents, images. But the actual folder itself doesn't tell you anything. But if you have a website, that top level folder can be a destination in itself. There is something there, right? There's something to learn from. But on a website, that top level folder there'll be a destination. But on mobile, very often the navigation and the constraints of your screen will mean that it's more like Windows Explorer. So you need to understand that when you're crafting your sitemap and your information architecture. Sounds a bit convoluted. Talk to me about it later if you're interested. Really, really, really critical to socialize your IA as early and as often as possible. A lot of people feel intimidated by the spreadsheet. They feel overwhelmed. They're busy. They want to be interested, but it just feels too much. And what happens is they won't give you feedback until the last minute, and it's all too late. So you need to really highly engage your stakeholders, people who need to understand and sign off and contribute to your information architecture early and often. And you need to use techniques so that you are really confident that they understand what you're genuinely proposing. And of course, the most important thing is to test, and test some more. So again, I have a whole presentation on how to test. I recommend that you need a very small subset. You can use 6, 7 people each cycle of testing. They need to be appropriate candidates that are reflective of your audience. And you need to do at least 4 rounds of testing. For those of you who work in tech, you will know that when you fix a bug in tech, you often introduce new bugs and the fixing of that bug. The same thing happens for information architecture. You'll do a test, you'll fix something, and then you'll inadvertently have created a new problem with the fix. You need to do at least 4 levels. And that leads me to my next point, which is about selling information architecture. Seriously, this is half the job. You think creating information architecture is hard? Selling it? Well, it's not that hard, but it's 50% of the work, and you need to be ready and primed for that. So the reason that testing is so important, not just to get you a really fabulous information architecture, but so that you can talk to executive, you can talk to your key stakeholders, and you can demonstrate to them absolutely what I've put forward to you as a solution is going to work. And at every single point, you want to be able to say, this evidence support the decisions I've made. And again, this goes back to that socialization, because IA is perceived to be high stakes. People are like, oh, what does this tell about the organization? The high level navigation of expression of your IA means a lot for our business, and people will get worried about it and they get stressed and they think, oh, is this going to be bad for us? And so you really need to be able to demonstrate why it is you've made those decisions and really reassure them that you've made the right call. One of the things that I did recently was that I worked in tandem with a search engine optimization specialist, and oh my gosh, it was so good, because what happened is I think at my second round of testing out of 4, I gave preliminary labels to this partner, and they ran search volume on every single one of those labels, and then they made recommendations. So for example, I think I add parking or find a park or something, and they gave a recommendation as to what that label would be, where there was greater search volume on that. And so then it was yet another layer of evidence to suggest why I had suggested that label, because, as experts in the writing field, you will know that writing appears and words appear to be simple to some folk. They don't forget that you've spent 20 years developing an expertise, and it feels like it's an area that they should weigh into. So you need lots of evidence to substantiate why you've chosen not only the order of your IA, but the labeling in your IA. And if you're confident, then you can say, look, no, I'm not going to change it for this reason, or oh yes. And then there are other areas where you can be more open to accepting their suggestions for change. Again, back to Rox's original point, but in this instance, you're not thinking about the audience who's consuming your IA, you're thinking about your internal stakeholders. What are they trying to do? Who are they trying to impress? What objective do they have managing their boss right now? What are their KPIs? What are they being judged on? Understand that in order to sell the IA effectively. And there shouldn't be a gap between what you produce and what they need to do. Your IA should be aligning with what those guys are trying to do. And you can probably tell that I'm thinking about this from a consultant point of view. I'm not thinking about it from an in-house point of view, but it works completely the same. So we hear this over and over again, but you have to take people on the journey. You have to make them feel like they have contributed to this process. And that's all coming back to this socialization. It's coming back to listening. It's coming back to involving them in card sorts. I mean, card sorts is a fascinating thing. A lot of people recommend that you card sort with a lot of people, and that you're looking to use card sorts to get an input to your information architecture. And sometimes you'll be super lucky, and you will see patterns emerge from a card sort that are actually useful in your information architecture. Mostly that's not the case. It's like, what? What do you mean? Why am I doing the card sort if it's not for that? Well, it's so that you can find a really constructive framework in which to listen to people, important stakeholders, and you can get stakeholders to do the card sort as well as potential audience. And you can start thinking, oh, how do they engage with and understand the content? And then they're much better primed and much more involved in the actual content environment, so that when you show them an information architecture, they remember that card sort exercise. They go, oh yeah, I remember what you're talking about, and I understand the complexity of the system that you're working within. We need to get better at talking to executive about these things. We need to understand what the C-suite are interested in and how to explain to them why the information architecture is important to them. Again, a whole other conversation. But if you feel that you're not doing that too well, if you feel like, oh no, that's my boss's job, think again. You need to get really good at this, and you need to understand what do your executives need and what are they concerned about when it comes to information architecture. Because you know what, between you and me, they're generally not too expert in this area. They know it's important, but they're looking for recommendations and advice and guidance from you. And so you need to know how to put that in a way that they can trust. Okay, I want to know more from you. Who's had to, and it can be about IA, or it can be some other kind of content or writing proposal that you've had, but I want to know how and where have you been successful in convincing your boss or other stakeholders about a particular decision that you know is really important. So it might be a labeling decision, it might be a particular content design decision, it might be an IA decision. I'd love to hear it, because it's all very well for me to saying this is what you do, but I want to give us an opportunity to learn from each other. And sneakily, I want to learn from you, of course. And I'll be incorporating that in my next red dot, in my next talk. So who's got something for me? Yeah? So I'm just going to whiz through, because I'm realising we're enjoying our conversation a little bit too much. I certainly am. I can tell by your faces you're loving it too. So what do you need to do? What do you need to deliver? You need to deliver a rationale deck. This is a good old Keynote or PowerPoint slide deck that says, this is what we've done, this is the process, this is the outcomes, this is who we talk to, this is why this is awesome, this is why you should sign it off. You might even put some TreeJack outputs in there. The TreeJack generates these really fabulous kind of diagrams that it's just people like, oh, that must be correct with that level of fidelity on the diagram. So that's always quite helpful. You can, if you want, some people are going to be interested in the spreadsheet. You really 100% need that spreadsheet of understanding exactly what your new information architecture is going to look like, mapping every single URL up to the level of detail that you've agreed on with your team. I try to only go to level 3 and get a bit more generic down there, and you'll see a lot of websites take the same approach. When you actually use them, you go, oh, it's a bit murky down here. So it depends on your requirements. I would also deliver the mind map, so which shows you that kind of really top level, and you can use a sitemap, you can build it in Azure or Sketch or whatever you want, even PowerPoint or Keynote if you use whatever tool you want, depends on the complexity. People will want to see that and they want to feel like they're across it. Potentially, you'll also want to deliver a migration plan. This is not technically IA, but if you are doing a redesign project, you'll want to map where the current content is to where it will live in the future. That will be a really critical deliverable for you. And also the sitemap, which could be expressed as the mind map, but probably will be more detailed. And this will be a key deliverable when you're liaising with your design colleagues. It's very unlikely you'll be handing over in a linear fashion to your designers. If that's the case, it's a bit unfortunate. Generally, you'll be collaborating with them and working together on them, but it's still really important that you do create that more technical sitemap, which has a little bit more detail on there and shows stacks of content, shows connections to systems that may not be. So, for example, I'm working with a university at the moment, and they have a whole bunch of content, kind of free-form content in one space, and then they're connected to a system which gives them a stack of events or a stack of news. And you'd want to, while the news and events might not be included in minute detail in your IA, you want to include the connection to those external systems in your sitemap. Wow, that was a lot to get through. Thank you so much for your avid attention. You probably will want to know so much more. There's so many resources. There's so many places that you can go to learn more, but these would be my 3 favorites. I think so if you want to be appear cool, you call this the Polar Bear book. You don't call it information. I think actually the new version is no longer for the World Wide Web. They've made it a bit more contemporary, but that's the Polar Bear book. It's thick and it's fantastic. You will learn everything you need to about information architecture there. Donna Spencer, fabulous Australian Donna Spencer, has written a really brilliant book about card sorting. So if you're wanting to learn more about card sorting, that book's a bit old now, but the concepts are 100% still valid. And she's actually published a lot online as well. So you can find a lot of resources from her there. And she's very generous with her knowledge. And Ambient Findability, it's probably 2 years old now, but it's thinking about some more contemporary ways that you might network and understand information, getting away a bit from that library science concept of information architecture, which is, an old idea, and thinking about how more contemporary technology might allow us to disseminate, categorize, syndicate, share information. So if you do want to learn more, I'm doing training workshops, which you are more than welcome to come. You are invited to. They cost big bickies, as you can imagine, from someone of my esteemed expertise. But why are you laughing, Swapnil? You don't know my sense of humour quite yet. Atlassian is fantastic. So we have Michelina and Warren and Karen and Ange in the room who are, they're so generous in sharing this space and their catering. And we've got amazing people like Swapnil who are running events like this. We also have the Sydney Content Strategy Meetup, which is another great place to find more about how you can take the way you communicate digitally and take it to that kind of strategic level. We've got the next one, as you can see, is talking about costing content. I'm really looking forward to this. So Letitia Mooney is coming from Adelaide to come and talk to us. There's about 150 people on the list. So I reckon about 70 will turn up. That's generally how it works. If you see it and you want to come and there's only wait list, make sure you get on the wait list. You will get a spot. And then after that, I'm so excited because we have Sarah Richards, London Sarah Richards, who's written this really fantastic book about content design. So kind of taking the principles of information architecture and applying it to single pages. She's going to come and talk to us about 4 weeks after that. So if you want to augment this fantastic meetup and you want to think about some places outside of technical writing that will really support this great meetup, then consider this one as well. Thanks so much for your time, guys. It was great to meet you.
Thank you very much, Elle. I think we have time for a quick question or two, if anybody has any.
Yes.
Elle doesn't get off that lightly. Anybody have any questions about IA, card sorting?
Come on, ask me one. Don't make me feel like you don't care.
It was just such an awesome presentation.
Thanks.
There are no questions.
What's your question? Thank you.
How do you go about crafting an IA for a website that you know is going to get really big really soon?
Ooh, that's interesting. So you're talking about scaling it up. You're thinking, okay, so I was listening to this really cool podcast the other day it was one of the ones on Radio National, and they were interviewing this brain scientist, and he was talking about mapping the human brain. So an incredibly, incredibly complex thing. And she said to him, how do you work this out? How do you figure out where you start, how you map this? And he goes, well, you chunk it into teeny weeny pieces, and then you try and figure out what do you know about those pieces, and do you know enough to kind of put them into a priority order, and then you start. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm pretty much a brain scientist, because that's what I do too. And it's a perfect strategy. So you think, okay, this is massive. What are the chunks? How can I break this down? How can I prioritize those chunks? And where can I start? And really importantly, who can help me? Yeah. Great question.
One more?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things I've been working on is trying to explain a whole lot of stuff about community and how community works, but and I think it's sort of book material length. And there are so many interdependencies of one thing. You need to explain one thing in order to be able to understand the next thing, and they all depend and interlink. And being able to work out how to get a web in a linear story.
You know, it's such a good question. So this is the thing, right? We as information architects and as content experts, as crafters and designers of content, we think about the connection between one page and the next a lot in just the way you described. But you know what's the common pathway of our users to our content? What am I doing? I have a task. I have a problem. I'm trying to sort something out. What do? I Google it. I get on my computer and I Google my task, and I come to a destination page. And that destination page is where I'm hoping to get my answer. I'm not interested in the contextual information that might explain the concept or might tell me where I can go next. Not really. I just want the solution to my problem on that one page. And that's where the information architecture becomes not wayfinding, but confirming the context and letting me know that I'm in the right place. And that's where, you know, your secondary or tertiary nav gives you clues. Oh yeah, this is the right answer for me. But I think we've really got to be like real with ourselves to say this is the common pathway. So the last 3 projects that I've worked on, big government and one commercial, we did analysis of the Google Analytics or the Adobe Analytics, and the 90% of our users came from Google to one page, maybe refined their search and got out again. So don't overinflate the importance of the connection between the content unless you understand that there's a complexity to the user task that you've identified through your user research and through the key scenarios that you've identified that require that complexity, that page jumping. Yeah, so it's really hard because you've got an expert and naive audience. So the expert doesn't want to get all that context and the naive does. So it's a challenge, you're right. Probably one we don't have time to go to now because I'm getting dagger eyes to get off the stage. Thanks so much, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Elle.